Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost, and I'm so happy to welcome you back to the Philanthropy Mastermind series, where our guests today should not be strangers to you, but in case they are, I will be doing a little introduction to them. They're popping up on the screen. You may not see them yet, but they are here. And first, I want to welcome you. This, of course, is entering our second quarter of the year, and we're doing about 120 programs this year. So happy you can be a part of that conversation. And this is an open invitation also to inform what we program for you for the rest of the year. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'll make sure to include my contact information at the conclusion of the presentation today so you can be a part of that. We do also want you to be a part of the conversation today. And there are a couple of ways you can do that, as you saw in our introductory slides. One is by using the chat, and some people are already there. So that's good to see. For those who haven't utilized it yet, please just jump down to the chat, say hello. Let us know where you're coming in from today, maybe which organization you're with. Feel free to use that as your sandbox to play. We really do want to see that full and robust conversation going on for you. We also have Q&A, which is a perfect place to pose your questions. And we'll be drawing from that throughout, and especially as we get towards the end of the conversation today. And this will be very much a conversation between two leaders in our field on this really important subject, which if you haven't encountered in your office, I'd be surprised. One way or another, I think everybody is feeling it, and the question is how to adjust for it. And that is, of course, this whole issue about how close is too close, the pros and cons of deep relationship building and fundraising. And there are lots of aspects to that, but I'm not going to talk about it. Our guests will. And for that, we have, of course, Anne Murphy, who is the CEO of Empowered Fundraising. And so Anne will talk to you about her work, which also is informed by many years in the field, working with, including Oregon State University Foundation and others. And she founded the firm not long ago during the pandemic, and she'll be talking about that, I'm sure, a little bit. And of course, Nathan Chappell, who is the Senior Vice President at DonorSearch AI, and also the author of The Generosity Crisis. And they will be able to tell you what inspired this session. And so with that, I want to step back, get out of the way, and let them have this great conversation with you. So thanks very much, both of you, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. It's great to be here. And it's always great when I have a webinar host that knows how to pronounce my last name. So I just count that as a total win, because otherwise it would be Nathan Chappell. But we go back a long way. I'm really excited for this opportunity to connect with you, and we have a great audience and a lot of friends on this call, and it's just awesome to see the turnout for something that I feel like it's a Monty Python thing of like, and now for something completely different. Because I'm usually here talking about artificial intelligence and deep learning and generative AI and all this stuff. And today we're going to take a pretty big departure and talk about something, really, really different. First, before I do that, I want to actually introduce how this topic got started. And then I want to tee up Anne a little bit to just kind of share a little bit more about her experience and why we're doing this together. But as Jay mentioned, a lot of people know that I recently wrote a book called The Generosity Crisis. And, while for sure, we hear from a lot of people that the first 100 pages are kind of a bummer because our industry is not healthy. A lot of the book is focused on this idea of going back to the roots of philanthropy and developing, meaningful connection and what we call radical connection. And it's been really encouraging and fun, an outcome of writing the book, that we get to hear different thoughts and what struck people, what people disagreed with, what they liked, what they hated. Anywhere in between. And we always just have counted this as a huge win because it means we're talking about generosity. One of my friends, Danny Fragala, who works at Children's Hospital Orange County overseeing the campaign, right after writing the book, she was one of the first people who read it and questioned me at lunch of like, what happens when this goes bad? Like, what happens when this idea of radical connection goes to a point where, it's too far and you've kind of crossed that boundary from employee to friend, and when bad things happen. And it really, that was a few months ago, it really stuck with me, and it was just it just so happened that, I started following Anne, and how can you not? Because she's just on LinkedIn like every 12 minutes. She does an amazing job of just like bringing people together. And honestly, what I think I admired the most was her ability to tackle difficult problems in a way that were practical and actually kind of uplifting, just because of her energy and her style. And so if you don't follow Anne already, you must, because I think she is one of the most fresh voices, of experienced voices in our industry, and that is willing to put the fun back in fundraising. And I think after 20 years of not having fun in fundraising, it's just like a breath of fresh air. And so, Anne, I want you to talk a little bit about, your experience and, what you're doing now, and also just some of your past experience, and then why you think, or why you said yes to this conversation.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. Thanks to you, Nathan and Jay and DonorSearch. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here. And it's really good to see some of my friends in the chat, as well as new friends too. I want to share a tiny anecdote about why it's so beautiful to be a fundraiser. And I love to think of myself as like your ultimate hype girl. I am such a huge fan of fundraisers and have so thoroughly enjoyed my career. But a few years ago, I was talking to my dad about the scholarship program that I've been working on at my university. And he wrote to me and he said, it reminded me of the fellowship that I got when I was at University of Michigan. And my dad was the first and only child in his family to go to college. And of course, that set my whole family off on a fantastic trajectory because my dad had gotten a college education. And what he said to me was, I always wondered about those nameless, faceless people. Who was it who talked to the donors, who put this scholarship in place? Like, who signed these papers? Who moved the money from one person to, somebody like him? And of course, he was utterly grateful for it, like so many of our beneficiaries are. And he concluded his note to me by saying, how glad he is that I'm one of those people, right? Just like all of you are, behind the scenes, making it possible for our donors to make these generous gifts to support our beneficiaries. And so I guess it kind of is in my DNA. And in fact, my dad's in the chat if anyone wants to say hi. He's Robert Murphy from Waterford, Michigan. So anyway, shout out to my dad, but sharing just, I feel really strongly about the power that fundraisers have and how noble our profession is. And that when we center the power that we have, right? When we show up comfortable in our own skin, working on common ground with donors and beneficiaries and organizational leaders, that's when we're at our best. That's when we are trusted partners with our, with the philanthropists. And so I'd kind of been thinking about how can I make an impact in the world that would help our fundraisers be their best. And that was the impetus for launching Empowered Fundraiser not too long ago. So we serve higher education, fundraising, professional development, and we have a couple of communities for fundraisers. So that's a little bit about my background, my family of origin as well. And how we got here to this conversation today, I'm going to give everybody here a little shot in the arm. So one of the ways that we got here was I reached out to Nathan and I asked him, would you ever want to collaborate on something? Knowing you have to shoot your shot in life, right? In our work, you have to ask donors, you have to aspire, you have to ask your community for help. But there is a level of vulnerability, right? And anytime we ask for help, there's a level of vulnerability. And I was prepared to be shot down, but Nathan said, yeah. And we started talking about our mutual interests. And this topic just comes up again and again, because here we are trying to build radical connections like Nathan and Brian talk about. But on the other hand, we kind of in my work centering fundraisers, we have to be really thoughtful about where is that line when we potentially lose ourselves in these relationships or lose our objectivity. And so that's kind of how this conversation came together. Nathan, do you think I kind of captured
That's
it?
awesome. No, yeah, and thank you for reaching out. It has been incredible getting to know you, and we've had, in even preparation for this, like we've had hour-long conversations that just fly by, and you know that you're having fun when you do that. And we both also found out that we're both really bad at calendaring, and so all kinds of things in common with one another. And so it's really great to be here. So as far as setting this up, really, first at kind of at this high level, like we have to really think about the type of connection we're talking about. And so I'll just frame this, and if you've read The Generosity Crisis, you'll see there's actually a framework for evaluating a connection that's transactional versus connection that's radical. And for a long time in our industry, the pendulum has swung so far to transactional, and a lot of nonprofits are transactional in their fundraising. And this is why 51% of Americans don't give, because essentially they feel like nobody cares. I'm just an ATM, you just want my money and I'm not going to hear from you. So we really work hard to redefine what connection means in a modern day fundraising program when you're competing against every corporate message and you're competing against 1.8 million other nonprofits messages, to build a type of connection that is deep and visceral in all of that. And that's what led to this conversation when Danny challenged me of like, I believe in all that. I believe in good old fashioned major gift work, but what happens when that goes too far? And thinking back in my career, I spent 20 years fundraising personally and then leading fundraising teams. And gosh, it didn't take long for me to think of a lot of things that I admittedly did wrong, and things that I had to intervene with other team members that had gone too far. And so we thought this is a conversation and a topic that we don't hear a lot about. It's a little bit nebulous. We do want to make this as conversational as possible. So please use the chat so that we can hear from you, challenge us. We don't proclaim to have all the answers for sure. This is really a start of a conversation. And why don't you talk a little bit about the group that you're going to host? I think it's on the 18th, right? To just go a bit deeper.
Yes. So one of the things that I've observed is that whenever we talk about certain topics, like our relationships with donors and boundaries, imposter syndrome, power imbalances, that folks always, there's a lot to share, right? We've got lots of thoughts and feelings, and we don't have opportunities to share them in our regular day-to-day life because we're too busy doing our jobs. And so I scheduled a roundtable discussion a week from today. It's at 11 a.m. Pacific. I'll drop the link to register in the chat. And it's just an opportunity for us to have like a chill, lightly facilitated conversation on this topic, come together, be in community, hear stories, hear best practices, and just be together having an extension of this conversation today. And you're all very warmly invited to join us.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you for doing that. I think it's a way to, peel back the onion from what we're going to just uncover today. So let's just get into it. Let's just talk about, from a starting point, this idea that, fundraising is the sacred space. We are what we consider intermediaries or stewards of a mission, of a vision, of an organization. And sometimes that can take a life of its own. And one of the things that Anne and I'm going to skip around here a little bit. Anne will just kind of meander. There's definitely things that we want to share with the group. But one of the things that came to me is that that people that get into fundraising tend to be altruistic, I hope, because, if you're not willing to carry the flag altruistically and you're not, part of the 49% of Americans that make gifts, you probably shouldn't be a fundraiser, just saying. So, maybe a different career choice for you. But for those that do, I feel like throughout my career, I surrounded myself about people who feel deeply and care deeply. And they believe that, life is more than just this moment, but, the work that I do today will matter for generations to come. And, when I die personally, like, I hope I made the world a little bit better, like just in my own little incremental, way. Does that type of person, does the condition of being we call it empathetic or altruistic or whatever, does that type of person tend to lend itself to someone who can get deep with an individual and easier than someone that would maybe be in a different profession?
Gosh, it's such a juicy question. I think that where I would say the distinguishing factor is between somebody who is altruistic and empathetic and prone to kind of how close is too close, right? That too close part is the ability to shift into a dispassionate place because we are running a business, right? So some of us are just wholeheartedly bringing our whole selves to the table, and we're super empathetic and compassionate and connect and high emotional intelligence and all those traits that make us really, really good at relationship building. I think where some of us can run into a little bit of trouble is when we have a hard time making that shift, right? Taking a step back and remembering that, yes, absolutely, radical connection is so incredibly important, and knowing our donors well is so incredibly important. And that does involve sharing aspects of ourselves. But at the end of the day, we do have our own friend group, our own families, and that is most appropriate. That kind of attention and bandwidth is appropriate in our friends and family community, maybe not quite as much poured into our work community, AKA in this case, our donors. So I would say the ability to take a step back and be dispassionate when necessary is like the distinguishing factor, Nathan.
That's such a good way to phrase that, to be selective, being selectively dispassionate. I've not really thought about that or heard about that. But, one of the things that Anne and I have been talking about and agree and disagree on certain aspects of this idea that when I've used Gallup Strengths Finders to essentially get a general sense of whether people are, more relational or more tactical, I do think there are some personality, like some of your primary personality strengths that can lend themselves to getting deeper than others. So when I look at Gallup, for instance, things like relator, which is one that I have, I'm a absolute introvert, but I get deep with people. I connect in a deep way with people I care about, versus someone who is just all, tactical, like all 5 of their top strengths were like, basically strategic, achiever, discipline, which I also have. But the relator part kind of keeps it human. I do think that some people find it easier to connect and some people find it harder to connect. And I think your statement of like being selective and maybe it's like being conscious of it. Like if I'm someone that tends to go too deep, and this is me personally, like I tend to get too deep too quick and then I get hurt because like I'm vulnerable, but at the end of the day, like I always have to reconcile with this. Am I glass half full? Would I rather be wrong? Would I rather give it forward, pay it forward and be wrong and hurt occasionally, or just be closed, So I think that idea of being conscious about who you are and what kind of makes your essence of like, this is something that, you've seen in your relationships, because you mentioned family and friends, that translates to work, right? And so if you're someone that tends to do that personally, you'll probably do that professionally as well.
Yes.
And so I think even more important to be mindful of that tendency to go a little bit too deep, too quick, with potentially with donors. So let's flip, because I know people want to get to the juicy part of like, and maybe we'll start with like, what does it look like? What does it look like? How close is too close when it's gone horribly wrong? So let's start with horribly wrong, and then let's go to like moderately wrong, just like how you're not your best. And then let's share a couple stories of like how close is too close when it's done right. In your opinion, no right or wrong answers. And we'd love to hear from others. If you agree or disagree, if you have your own stories.
Well, where do we start? Do we start with gone
Start with
right?
horribly wrong. Start with what's the worst case that you've seen? It doesn't have to be about you, but it can be. About an instance when how close was too close and things just went awry. And you can contextualize it and say it was, decades ago and whatever, but or just stories you've heard.
It's almost impossible to choose one or two. So only because of what we've already kind of leaned into, which is there is so much crossing of boundaries, right? Well, our work kind of lives in the gray area, right? It's business, but it's also business that's conducted socially. And if you put us in any particular context, put us in an event, for example, is it business or is it social, right? And it's really hard. Like, how do you decide in every single moment, right? Being really super self-aware is critically important, but that's not going to solve all the gray areas. I think let me share this because it's super practical. One of the things that we see when it's going wrong is that a development officer will gatekeep their donor. First of all, using terms like my donor, right?
Mhm.
So when it's hard for other development officers to get access to that donor or information about the donor, or you see that the DO is removing that donor's name from prospect list or from the annual giving mailing, or you're hearing lots of stories that really don't have anything to do with the gift relationship. What I want to share with the crowd is that as a development officer managing a portfolio and having some donors who you especially care about, you may have the instinct to quote unquote protect them. Your leadership is never going to believe you that the donor's not going to make a gift to that particular project. You can absolutely say, till you're blue in the face, I know so-and-so really, really well, and I guarantee you they are not going to make a gift for XYZ project.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
don't have your feelings hurt about it. It's not leadership's job to take your word for it because they're running a business, right? They need a building funded or a multidisciplinary project funded. So as you start to feel that pull to kind of like protect your donor, rather than being their trusted advisor, you can be the person who curates what they get asked for, but that feeling of needing to kind of distance them from the organization, that's where you start to know that you've gotten a little bit too close. Now, I wouldn't say that's disastrous. Nathan, you might want to share a disastrous one, but
No, all those are great points. And actually, we'll spend a little bit more time there because I think this is where the meat of this conversation would be really practical for the audience. You're essentially, I think what you're sharing is that, you end up in that friend zone, right? If you get too close is too close, or how close is too close, is you're in the friend zone. And Ann and I've talked about some of those symptoms or some of the things that kind of manifest from that, which is you hear the donor's name a lot. Like, you're saying the donor's name a lot in a disproportionate amount to other donors. Like, John and I were on their boat together down at the yacht club, or we're doing this other thing together, and you're just mentioning it disproportionately. And so that's one of them. I mean, being in that friend zone. But I think what you just shared also was so insightful, because like, when you start to protect the donor, like, who do you work for? Do you work for the organization or do you work for the donor? And I see a lot of this throughout my career, especially managing fundraisers, is that when fundraisers were defensive about the prospect, not their whole pipeline, but specific prospects, almost defensive that they are representing the donor as an advisor and knowing their best interest above the organization. And often, and we'll get into kind of remedies on this in a little while, but really kind of still breaking down like all these telltale signs. But something Ann said to me earlier today was, I thought, so insightful. And she said, do you know who knows if you're too close with a donor? Why don't you share it, Ann?
Yeah.
I thought it was
So,
brilliant.
I mean, here's who knows if you're too close to the donor is your colleagues in prospect research, prospect management, advancement services, whatever it may be called at your organization, the folks who are behind the scenes working with you hand in hand, but who are watching the data and see that you've had a certain number of meetings and that things haven't moved forward. And of course, oftentimes they do read the contact report. They're seeing how long a proposal has been open, and they are utterly dispassionate because they don't know the donors. Like, they don't know the donor's whole life story and their hopes and their dreams and their fears and their joys, which is what makes us so good at our jobs, is that we know all those things, but it's also so tempting to be like, well, well, they're not ready to move forward, but a prospect researcher is going to look at it and go, yeah, that's something that jumps off the page. Kind of related, Nathan, to kind of who knows. There's a way that we as development officers know really well that we've gotten too close to a donor. And it's when we start to feel kind of like we've gotten over our skis emotionally or psychologically with our donors. When we start to feel, because fact of the matter is we're not psychologists, right? We're not therapists. We do not have training for conversations about really deep emotional, psychological topics, right? We all know that we have a certain level of emotional labor that goes into this field, but they're often, well, at least I've had this, I will share that I've had this happen where I just get a feeling like a little beehive in my chest of, I now am entered into a conversation that I'm not fully capable of navigating, right? There is toothpaste out of the tube that I don't know how to put back in, right? And after a meeting, I can feel like I'm still recovering from this. I don't know how to process it. And that to me just means that we've definitely crossed a professional boundary, right? We've gone into emotional boundaries, and that I'm ill-equipped, truth be told, to navigate them. Yeah.
So why don't we stay on that a little bit, because I think that's something that has been really interesting to think about in preparing for this webinar. Is both, it's impossible to talk about how close is too close without talking about physical boundaries. So we should talk about that as well, because I think it's an absolutely important conversation, but the psychological boundaries, the thing I think we take for granted a lot, because I think it's that blurrier line of like, well, they consider me a friend, and they want to invite me to do special things, or they give me gifts, or whatever it might mean. The idea that, to create psychological boundaries means that you have to be conscious about it. Like you have to, really be objective. And I think there's ways to do that. I mean, if one is, something one of my first mentors ever told me back early, right when I graduated from undergrad, which was, your success is going to be in your ability to view your work through your boss's eyes. And that stuck with me a long time ago. I won't say how long, but a long time ago. And it stuck with me because I really reflected on that. I mean, it was one of those pieces of advice that, for decades has been there, like, I'm going to do this work, but it's really more important to see how my boss would interpret the work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Ann and I have shared and talked about is that, as a fundraiser, it's easy to get caught up in the moment. I mean, we've both spent, a few decades fundraising, and it's easy to get swept up into the excitement, enthusiasm. I think one of the things that we underestimate is that when people give money, there's that rush of dopamine and serotonin. Fundraisers get that same rush when someone makes a gift, because you helped facilitate it. You're part of it. You feel like you helped make it happen. So there's a lot of that enthusiasm with that. So it's easy to get swept up in that without those psychological boundaries. And all of a sudden you realize you've crossed this line. And then all of a sudden you're getting, a tap on your shoulder from your boss who's saying, hey, why isn't this person moving forward fast enough? Or why is this person seem to be stalled? And then you're making excuses of why, because, their grandkids, stepdaughter just had a surgery, and, they're going to buy a new car. Like, it's like all these stories that you probably shouldn't know. But you realize at that moment, like, no one really taps on your shoulder and says, hey, I think you're too close. Most of the time they're like, why isn't this thing happening? Sure. And so, maybe we spend a couple of minutes on really, I think from a practical perspective of like, what are some ideas around that accountability that you could have, either your internal accountability or among your peers or others, that could help you keep that objectivity and kind of check you on like, are you seeing this objectively versus are you too close?
It's a great question, and one that I wish I had asked myself like 25 years ago, because it just took a really long time to get to the point where I could see myself through my boss's eyes and understand like, here are some indicators. Here's what I might do differently, because by the way, it was working just fine. Thank you very much. Right. Like my style of building relationships was working great. I, was raising money and engaging donors, and all indicators would have been like on on my dashboard that this is great. What I didn't factor in was kind of, what's the emotional toll of some of those relationships, and what would it be like when the relationships are gone? One of the things I think that we absolutely should ask ourselves is, how do we know? So an example would be, you just brought up, kind of a nephew's, niece's sister-in-law, brother-in-law is having a thing. I'll give you another use case, which is you may hear yourself say, well, their daughter is getting married and they're paying for the wedding.
Mhm.
So the question to yourself would be, what evidence do you have that they're not ready to make a gift just because they're paying for a wedding? Like we feel, right? So we're putting our own money mindset onto that donor. We don't know if it means they can't afford making a gift. I mean, for some people, paying for a wedding is like no big deal. Plus a wedding could be $1 bajillion. It could be, several thousand.
Yeah.
And so I think asking yourself, how do I know, is a really important. Is there any evidence of this? Because we're applying some pretty limiting beliefs. So that's one stopgap that I would recommend, is ask yourself, how do I know?
Yeah. Another thing that Ann and I were sharing too, just in our career, is that, when you're working with a team, if you have the luxury of working with a team of other fundraisers that you trust and that you learn from and you trust, I think there's the opportunity to create not just a buddy system from a physical perspective. And I definitely want to talk about this on this call, just because I think it's something that is also uncomfortable and something that's not talked about enough in our industry, of like how to physically protect yourself, how organizations have the duty to make sure that their staff members are safe, because there are plenty, unfortunately, stories of things that have gone wrong. But in this idea of still staying on the psychological boundaries, can you have a buddy that you check with and to say, hey, once a quarter or once a month, like I want to review my top prospects and check myself, and then do that with each other, so that you both share each other's top prospects and like check yourself. This is what I'm thinking. This is what, I think the timeline is. This is what I think will fulfill their donors' wishes in the best way possible, and allow the space for that honest feedback.
Mhm.
In my career, I don't think I've really ever seen that effectively. I have managed that system from a leadership perspective lots of times. So, I mean, holding specific, fundraiser meetings to say, kind of essentially defend yourself of why you think this is the right timeline. But how much better would it be if you were proactive about this? Again, seeing your work through the lens of your boss's eyes. Like if you're proactive about this work, not only you're going to be better off because you're going to be more successful more often, but you're going to be more donor centric as well. If you have the ability to kind of do a gut check with someone else that you trust to allow that feedback to come in. It's amazing to me, like anytime I've brought fundraisers together, if I've ever been stuck on a donor, or I see a fundraiser stuck on a donor, bring others together. And it's amazing how they're like kind of that third party objectivity, like all of a sudden, like creative ideas like just start coming because you're too close. I mean, 100% is because you can't see the forest through the trees. You're just not objective. You're thinking about the wedding and not all these other things that have, incredible signs from the donor saying, I want to make a difference, or whatever it might be. So however you do that, you pause, you schedule time for yourself to really be introspective about this, or you schedule time with others that you trust, and you have that two-way conversation and allow for that space.
And along those lines, just a vote of confidence to everybody, anyone who's on this call right now, I know for sure, if you connect with them on LinkedIn, they would be happy to have this conversation with you. I understand we're in a very high performance field.
Right.
And sometimes it's just maybe too scary, right? To choose somebody, certainly when there's a power imbalance, right? I have had people tell me that they don't want to reveal like what's going on with a particular donor, which of course is an example of it probably being too close, but there's concern that, the other development officer might see an in. So if you have any trepidation about having those open conversations with another fundraiser, reach out to your colleagues. Like, your community is totally here for you. You just got to ask. So like I said,
Yeah.
anyone who's on this call, become friends with them, set up an accountability, meeting every quarter, every month or whatever to talk about your portfolio.
Yeah. Get a fundraising coach, talk to a peer, talk to your boss. What a win would that be? It's like, hey, boss, like I want to gut check to make sure that I'm being objective about this donor. I mean, again, these are somewhat simple but novel things that I don't think happen a lot. And again, I think as we're really distilling all of this, it's like putting yourself ahead of the mission, right? Putting yourself ahead of the mission ends up leading to this potential of like getting too close with a donor versus truly recognizing you are a steward of the organization, of the objective of what you're trying to achieve, and that donors will have many other stewards throughout a period of time. It's not about you, it's about the organization. I've always loved that sense, and unfortunately real world is that you've got revenue goals and things like that, but like if you truly did your job, and I saw Alex wrote something about stewarding the donor before the gift. If you truly doing your job in stewarding a donor, you never have to ask for money. Like the theoretical like aspect of this, if you did it so well, you wouldn't have to ask this. People, you would be helping fulfill their destiny. But at the end of the day, we live in the real world where you have to, a lot of times get to that level where you're going to ask. And at the end of the day, you have to be objective to be able to do that. So let's pivot over, because it's not fair to the group if we don't talk about physical boundaries, because I think I've seen some difficult circumstances in my career, and a lot of them, unfortunately, I think were brushed off. Some of them were dealt with very aggressively and proactively, which was never easy and fun. But let's talk, because I don't think you can think about this topic of how close is too close and not think about how our organization needs to prioritize physical boundaries, and now how individuals also need to protect themselves. So why don't you share your thoughts there, and then I'll weigh in.
Well, I'll start by saying, picking up on what Nathan said about being able to talk to your boss, and how important it is to be able to surface these topics like before they're big issues, when they're just like murmurs in your brain that, I'm starting to wonder, is this too close? Being able to surface that with your immediate supervisor is really important, not only because you want to be having that dialogue and you want their support, but also from a risk management perspective. Now, not everyone is going to feel comfortable bringing this stuff up to their bosses. So right now I'm speaking to the leaders. Create psychological safety in your teams. Normalize talking about, physical, all boundaries, but especially when it comes to physical boundaries. Make it okay for staff to bring that up. It is incredibly vulnerable. There's thoughts of, I think we probably all, this is in the zeitgeist, we know this, but there's feelings of, is it my fault? Right? Did I do something? Am I allowed to reinforce a boundary that I as a human being have, or am I supposed to be okay with it because this donor is a big donor, right? There's gaslighting. Like, did that thing really happen? I was all by myself with the donor. Nobody was around. That seems weird that happened. Maybe I made it up in my head. There's he said, she said, right? Or he said, or she said, she said, or they said, they said. There's not wanting to get people in trouble. I just heard that last week from a fundraiser who had an experience with a donor, didn't tell anybody because she didn't want to get him in trouble, and then had the experience of that donor doing the same thing, but in front of a student, which then gave her the motivation that she needed to get over that limiting belief about letting people know that this had happened. So I think, there's a lot of vulnerability, and it's important for all of us to embrace that so that we can have these conversations without some of the stigma, without some of the fear around it, that there could be some negative blowback. And I will say that I've absolutely had that in my career. I've got, unfortunately, too many examples of when I didn't raise it, right? When I never said anything. I'll be vulnerable and I'll share an example from actually within the last 2 years. So here I am, I'm like at the peak of my career, right? I'm senior leader, I have chops, like there's no question that I'm here. I'm not here for my health. I'm here because I'm part of a business. And a donor said to me in front of another senior leader, he said, so vulnerable, but well, if I had known how pretty you are, I would have taken your call sooner. And I mean, like in a moment, all of my chops, all of my 25 years, all of my intelligence, all that stuff just like went poof. Like all of a sudden I've been reduced to if this, then that. If I,
Right.
you know, my kids say about stuff like this, like, congratulations on your face. Like, it's not, I showed up here, but I wasn't here so that you could say anything like that to me. I was here as your trusted advisor in philanthropy, but he was a principal gift donor. And so I kind of processed it and thought, I'm just going to let this one go in one ear and out the other. And again, it's one of those things where hindsight is 20/20, because it wasn't until later that I thought through that I've now set the next woman up for that same conversation by not saying anything to him, by letting the vice president who was there in the call with me also look the other way. I've now created, I've supported a culture of this kind of dynamic being completely acceptable, which we know it's not. So even after all these years, I get it. Like I'm still susceptible to it.
You know, thanks for sharing that and being vulnerable. And I'm sorry that happened to you. I mean, that is not what I think most people that get into philanthropy and fundraising, if we think about the highlights of our career, it's been the truly generous, altruistic people that don't take advantage of their privilege in that way. And one of the things you said to me that really struck home the other day, which was, you know, in talking about a similar type of circumstances, that it's like the Warren Buffett thing, like never do anything that you wouldn't want to see in, you know, tomorrow's newspaper. But in your case of like not wanting to do anything that a younger person wasn't seeing and thinking that you just modeled that behavior and that's okay. And so, you know, that gut check of like, yeah, if I allow that, then that will continue to perpetuate. And if someone saw that, then they would, you know, think that was how we conduct fundraising. I will say, you know, fundraising's changed a lot in the years. I mean, a lot. I mean, 20 plus years ago when I started in the industry, I will say, I don't know if there is more bad behavior or now just because of social media, like, you know, people are a little, hopefully more reserved than they were before, but maybe not. Maybe that's just me, my optimistic Pollyanna. But when there was no guide star and there was no real accountability, I just heard horror stories of how, you know, in fact, you know, our profession, there wasn't really even a master's program in fundraising up until, you know, 20 years ago. So like people were just getting into this because they needed, you know, they either hated their job or they were, just got into it by accident. And now we've seen a professionalization of our industry, I hope, that will bring about more of these conversations. But even this conversation, I have a master's in nonprofit administration, never had this conversation in my master's program.
Right.
So I think it's still a long ways to go.
So I see a bunch of comments, a bunch of questions about how I would do it differently.
Well, that's perfect, because I was going to ask you if you could ask your 22-year-old self what you would have done differently, but you shared something that was only 2 years ago. So
yeah, well, a couple of thoughts. So one is, if I were speaking to my 22-year-old self, I would say, you are going to crush it in this career, and it is not dependent on you being okay with certain boundary crossings. You do not need to go along with this. You can deflect. You can ask for a different relationship manager. You can tell your boss. You can call this out. And I was fortunate to have a couple of examples of when my bosses, stuck up for somebody, including when I was at University of Illinois, and one of our unit heads said they would absolutely cut off, communication with a particular donor because that person had crossed a line with a development officer. I think what's tricky is not knowing how your organization is going to respond, whether they're going to support you or not. And I promise I'm not going to leave this as a cop-out. I am going to answer the question, but I will say that wouldn't it be great if we addressed this before we needed to?
Right.
Wouldn't it be great if we were utterly clear about what our policies are, what our values are, what our perspective is, and what we're willing to do in our work with our donors to clarify what their expectations are, or what our expectations are as well. And I have this dream of a day when our donors get onboarded as they become, like, they hit a certain level, or who knows what the tipping point is. But just like in higher ed, when we're connecting a donor with a student, they need to go through a training, right, about what it's like to work with students and what the expectations are, et cetera. I would love to see us have an onboarding like that for donors.
Yeah.
Here are the rules of the road, right? Our staff are here for XYZ and not here for ABC. Here's what we do when we find out that something has gone awry. Like, we know your relationship with this institution is very important, and we're here to support that. And when, and here's what we're going to do to support it, and here's what we expect you to do to support it. But I will say, if I had it to do over again, there are a number of things I would have said and a number of things I would have done. One is I would have instilled a little bit of levity, because that's my comfortable place. If I were to get the words out of my mouth, I would have to use a little bit of humor. It's just how I am. So in an effort to get the words out of my mouth, I probably would have been a little bit light about it. I would have said what I always say when my kids were little and people would say, "Oh, she's so cute." I would say, "And smart." She's cute. Yeah,
That's
she's
great.
cute. She's
Yeah.
5 years old, and she's adorable, and she's also whip smart. So
Right.
let's not forget about that. So I probably would have said, if you think that's a reason to take my call, just wait until we get down the road working on your gift, and you can see how magical I can be. Or something like that, something about my chops and something about how I'm not here for that. The other thing I would have done is I would have absolutely positively pulled my vice president aside and said, "I'm not going to let that one go. We're going to have a meeting, right? We're going to have the 3 or 4 of us in a room. We're going to have to talk about what the donor did, and somebody's going to have to do something about it." Instead of kind of just eating it and moving on with my life and telling you all this story right now, I would have liked to have escalated that so that there's some boundaries put on who that donor had the privilege of interacting with in the future, because they are lucky to work with such brilliant people.
Yeah, so wise. Like, I just so much there, and so much wisdom in everything you just shared. So thank you for sharing that again. And I, as someone who I am notoriously bad at thinking about a good retaliation in the moment, for no matter the circumstance, let alone in a power imbalance. So it would be literally like 2 a.m. the next morning. I'd be like,
Oh, 100%, 100%.
With that said, my encouragement, and this is, many, many years of leading fundraising teams, I would respect so much if a team member came to me, the next day or 2 days later, or 2 weeks later, and said, "This thing happened. It's really been bothering me. I'd love to be able to talk with you about it." Those are never fun conversations. This is, for fundraising leaders, this is called, work. It's called work for a reason. It's not all, if it was fun, it was called fun, we wouldn't get paid to do it. And I've had many of those conversations, and unfortunately, and sometimes they go okay, and there's reconciliation, and sometimes they've gone horribly wrong. I can tell you though, almost in every circumstance I can think of, times where it was ignored, there was like this spidey sense that something was going on over a period of time, and things don't tend to get less, they tend to get more. And you let these things go. I mean, there's one that I had it just the spidey sense, like the hair on your neck goes up and you're like, something's wrong. No one's sharing anything, but something's wrong. And lo and behold, ends up in a harassment lawsuit many years later, with someone else. But it's just, had someone brought it to my attention, at someone, if I had, maybe created a place of safety or even encouraged it, like, not waiting for someone to come to me, but saying, hey, is there something going on? My spidey sense is up, I want to create a space for you to share. So it goes both ways. I mean, everyone's responsible for this, but again, all of this to say, this idea that fundraising is a sacred space. It's truly, it's a very interesting kind of place to be, to know intimate details about people and their aspirations and their views on life and life beyond, because we're talking about really the greatest manifestation of a person's commitment to organization is when they die. So they're telling you about like what they want to live on even after they're not here on earth. Like that is a really a sacred space. And I think with that comes that need to really be, clear and with yourself, with those around you, of like understanding the levity of that role and and what it carries with it. And then the space to actually talk about those in a productive way. Our industry needs this. Like, let's be clear, like we need more fundraisers that can create meaningful connection with individuals and help them fulfill their philanthropic aspirations. But we have to do it in a way that's healthy, that's safe, that is sustainable, that will inspire more people to give because of how well it was conducted. And most people that are probably on this call, I hope, have been in that sense of flow when that works that way. Like for the most part, that you can work with donors and then, 1 + 1 = 5, and you just want to do that all day long. So, but it only takes a few, either bad actors or even missteps in allowing yourself to, like, it's just that one more thing. And it's just that it's always these incremental things. So as we're kind of wrapping up, we only have 8 minutes left. I knew this would happen. And like, I was up in the middle of the night, like, enough to talk about, but every time we're on the phone, it's just like, it goes by so quick.
Can I just say one little thing about what I'm seeing in the comments?
Yes.
I promise I'll be brief. So Lisa and Jennifer, I am really resonating with what you're sharing and seconding, because we couldn't talk about this and almost borderline can't still. But we're starting to, because the word has gotten out, right? The AFP study about sexual harassment, and I think it was 70% of fundraisers saying that they've been in those situations, either with a donor or with a colleague. The word is out, and now we have a bit of an issue with bringing new people into our industry. So, Gen Z, we think that Gen Z is going to fix everything, of course, but Lisa, like you and I, we still can change things. We can still make things a lot better. And I would love to have that conversation with anyone on the call. Like, what can we do differently in our remaining years in this field? Because we were so conditioned to not bring it up. Here we are now, we're bringing it up. So,
I love it. And I'm so grateful to you and for your willingness to do this and have this conversation. And I'm really grateful that DonorSearch gives us this platform to allow others to kind of weigh in, because again, this starts with you. And so as we wrap up, and I think this goes to when I think Abby's question.
Abby, I do have an answer. We'll connect later.
So I mean, that's kind of where I wanted to end this. Like, so why don't you kind of take that on, answer Abby's question, and really around kind of wrapping around this idea of like, how do you like, what are the warning signs, like, or how do you just proactively kind of look out for something's not right? Where do I pause versus just finding out when it's after the fact?
So I have a TikTok series on this. If anyone is interested, I have a TikTok series on how to maintain your personal safety as a fundraiser. But Abby, I absolutely have rules about meeting places. I have rules about meeting times. I have rules about what people eat and drink, or what I eat and drink around them. And I would be happy to share more about that, and at any moment in time. I absolutely believe that if your spidey senses are going off and you're worried that you did not know what you were walking into, that's a huge, just connect with me on LinkedIn. Just put in hashtag Ann Murphy Philanthropy. Yes. Okay. But taking this to a general level, I'll say that knowing ahead of time what your boundaries are is absolutely critical, right? You're not going to come up with your boundary on the spot, right? Whether it's a professional boundary or an emotional boundary or a physical boundary, it is not going to come to you in that moment. You are not going to know how to execute on a plan because you won't have a plan. Right. So I would recommend, doing the self-work in advance. Like right now, based on this conversation, it's clear, right, that there is a too close, right? There's a how close, is it too close? There's just close enough, right? I'll share that I spent 10 years in one unit at one point in my career, and I had the opportunity to get to know my donors so incredibly well. And, babies were born, people died, there were weddings, everyone had, hi, Theo, can you close the door? I have a kid home from school. And those were all examples of, hi, thank you. Hi, everybody. Okay. Those were all examples of when it wasn't too close. It was like just close enough. And when I moved out of that unit and had a different portfolio, I missed those people. Just like you do when you finish a book that was really, really good and you just loved the characters so much and the book is done and you're like, I wonder what's happening with so-and-so. I was at my most effective when I was able to get that close, right? It wasn't too close. It was just close enough. They knew me. I knew them. I chose what I was going to share. Like I went through a divorce during those 10 years. Did I talk about my divorce? Absolutely not. Did people ask me why I didn't have a wedding ring? Of course. How you navigate that also, the point that I'm getting to is that it leads to our own satisfaction, right? Our own enrichment of our lives, our own self-actualization. So if we can do the work that's required for us to know what our boundaries are and for us to create psychological safety in our workplaces so we can have this conversation, then I absolutely believe that we will know what the difference is between too close and not close enough. Hi, Tammy Zonker. So happy you're here.
I love that Tammy's on this call. Great. Thank you, Tammy. All right. So I can't believe it. We're at an hour. The reality, at least for me, what's sinking in here is that this conversation needs to happen a lot more. I think it's for males and females. And I love the comment that was posted a little bit ago by Jeff of like, what can the men do as well? Like we can have these conversations in a way that's productive and non-discriminatory. And at the end of the day, like we as donors want to feel valued and we want to be a part of an organization, their success. We're not striving to be everyone's best friend, but as fundraisers, we have that ability to be that conduit. And so it really is a really great space. So one more time, and just again, huge thank you for not only this, but everything you're doing in our industry. And as far as your follow-up conversation, I hope, and it sounds like we've sparked some insight here. People want to, peel back the onion and get a little bit deeper and more an intimate gathering. Yeah. I think it's awesome. So thanks for carrying that flag and for allowing me to help, bring this conversation to light with you.
Thank you. Thanks to DonorSearch. Thank you, Jay. Thank everybody for being here and for the conversation. I'm so happy to be connected to all of you. And please do continue the conversation with me. Reach out on LinkedIn, join our session 1 week from today. We'll be delighted to have you all.
Thank you both so much. Really do appreciate you. Great conversation, as we can tell from all the conversation in the chat, that people want to continue this. So if you haven't seen this in the chat, please look over there. We have that link in there appearing a couple times. Plus, there will be a note sent to everybody who's here with us, as well as those who registered but couldn't join us, with a link to that session. So please keep an eye out in your email. And if you find that you don't see it, it means it's probably gone to spam. Make sure that you have DonorSearch whitelisted so you can get announcements about things like this. Thank you both so much for doing this. Really do appreciate you.
Thank you both.
I also want to invite all of you to maybe meet Nathan, and I don't know if you'll be there, Anne, at AFP.
You will.
Yes.
Okay, well.
I'm going to be there. I'm going to be at your party.
So you all asked, that's right, of course. So you all asked about where can you find Anne? Well, you can find her on LinkedIn. You can find Nathan there. And if you want, you can find me there. You'll see that in the chat as well. But there's also going to be an opportunity to meet these people, as well as a lot of other leaders who have been part of the Mastermind series at the AFP Icon in New Orleans. If you don't know what we're talking about, well, just Google it because you'll find it. But we have several things happening there in addition to an opportunity to talk with these folks. And one is that we have several interviews happening with the people who received the Outstanding Fundraiser of the Year award, as well as the Young Professionals Award. So all of that's occurring live, and I think that'll be on LinkedIn Live on Monday and Tuesday. Please be on the lookout for an announcement about that, and you'll learn more about that and everything else in some slides we have coming up right now. So please stay tuned as we disappear and watch for that, including a QR code to learn more. So Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.
And again,
thank you,
so
everybody.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.